I have to share an anecdote on this.
Okay.
I reached out to him via email and said, hey, do you have time I have something to tell you, which was inviting him for this conversation. First email went unanswered. A few days later, I email him again, then I get an answer. And I talk to him, and then he tells me, Pino, I never answer any email the first time. Which is a way to manage attention. Right.
We're here with William Ocasio, and he is a professor of business and leadership at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign at the Gies School of Business. We're going to be talking about attention in decision-making, and we're trying to get a sense of what actually this is. I am Professor David Maslach, and this is I'm at Florida State University, and this is Professor Pino Audia at the Tuck School of Business. What is attention? What are we talking about?
William James said very famously, everyone knows what attention is. It's about taking possession of the mind of one among alternative trains of thought. And that's exactly the inspiration for my own work on attention. And that was a quote from Herbert Simon, who of course is the Nobel Prize winner in economics in 1978. What are you focusing on that over a particular period of time, and not just immediately? Right? Because that's really what shapes decision making, right? Not so much whether you notice something, because most of the things you notice, you forget. Who cares? I'm sorry. What color your publisher is, right? No way that you can use all the information that's available to process that information. We're actually all information processing machines, right? Now we do it in multiple complex ways. I'm not saying that everything's about information processing, but to the extent that we process information, we cannot use all the information that's available. We then have to select on some and focus on some and not on others. That is why attention is so critical.
How would you think about theories of decision making that recognize the importance of attention, and others that are less focused on the importance of attention? As a business school professor, as a scholar, and you look at the world of decision making, where is the place of attention in the different theories that people use?
The economic theories of attention assume kind of omniscience in attention, right? You have all the available information, you have all the available criteria, you have all the available range of alternatives, and then you optimize on that. It's a simple but brilliant observation of Herbert Simon that there were cognitive limits on rationality, right? And actually, if you read the initial book, the cognitive limits of rationality are about attention. We don't have the capacity to process all the information, so we have to pay and focus our attention. And he quoted William James on a selective set of alternatives, on a selective set of criteria. Now, what he focused, Herbert Simon, on his work on decision making was on decision premises, right? So our decision premises are shaped by the firm, right? That is basically the fundamental idea of Herbert Simon. But then decision premises shape the attention. I brought to the foreground the notion of attention that was in the background of what we might call the Carnegie School of decision making, right? It was always there. It was there in Herbert Simon. It's there in the March and Simon book on organizations. In the foreword to the second edition of March and Simon's book on organization, it says the following. We wrote this book as a theory of decision making, but it's really a theory about attention, right? Because it's the attention that's shaping the decision-making process.
And what cues you to start paying attention to something?
The attention research, you can talk about top-down determinants of attention and bottom-up determinants of attention, right? The top-down are things that you bring to the situation or the environment brings to the situation, right? So your boss tells you, please, do an analysis of this particular decision on marketing. So the boss is focusing your attention, which is what I was talking about, how leaders focus people's attention, right? So that's a lot of what happens in organization, right? Or now the technology is shaping our attention, right? So there's a lot of multiple triggers. And there's the bottom up is the characteristics of the stimuli that can capture attention, right?
So that's really complicated. Yeah.
So, for instance, most of the time we're not paying a lot of attention to the stock market, right? Because there's ups and downs happen, every day. But okay, the other day the stock market went down. I don't know how many, 5%, 7% a day. Well, everybody's paying attention to the stock market, right? Mm-hmm. Because that stimuli captures your attention. That's kind of the bottom up, because that stimuli is large enough, salient enough, big enough. Your attention may be focused on the future. Right. So also, are you meeting your goals? Right. Not in terms of what has happened in the past. Are you moving fast enough? Right. I want to grow 8% a year. Well, if I grow 5%, that's not good enough. Right. So I have to kind of revert and maybe make a new decision with respect to what I want to do is best for the organization.
In effective decision making, in some line of thinking, are related to humans being fallible in their ability to assess statistical probabilities, for example. The rarity of an event, right? Anchoring is a good example, right? An event occurred recently, becomes more salient, people think the probability of occurrence is much greater than it really is, right? So ineffective decision making sometimes is due to flawed ways of processing data. Through an attention lens, what could be instead different ways of reaching bad decisions?
In my research, for instance, I've done some research on General Electric, right? Maybe not the best example now, but this was like General Electric long time ago, right? But for many years, they were like the masters of doing this. They had set up these managerial systems every year, making sure, okay, this is what you predicted, this is what you said. Is your prediction going to be correct or not? General Electric developed new technologies on both CT scans and MRIs. The X-ray people know the CT scans that's not going to go anywhere. Well, and there was the boss was saying, are you sure? Yeah. So then the next year they come in, they look at the data, wait a minute, your prediction was wrong. Right? So in fact, there's a control system for even though the initial decision was wrong, they were able to revisit that. So the reason General Electric was so effective was not because they made all the right decisions all the time, because they did not, but they were able to revise the decisions in a periodical way with additional facts, right? The reason it doesn't work that right now is because that used to work when the velocity of change was a lot less than it is now, right? Now having a review every year, that's not good enough. The most innovative part of my research on attention is that the notion of situated attention. So it's not that you're always paying attention to the same thing. When people talk about capacity limits of attention, they're really at the very localized situation, right? So in a particular meeting, in a particular situation, you're not going to be able to pay attention to everything. Mm-hmm. But so there are times that this is going to be meeting, is going to be focusing attention on this particular issue. The particular issue is what are the plannings for the next year for this particular division. That was the model of General Electric. And given the speed of technological change and competition at that time, that worked very well because they were doing better than anybody else.
The attention folks in psychology, for example, they would do these sort of classic controlled studies. One of the videos that everybody has probably seen. If you haven't seen it, by the way, it's really great. You're supposed to count a bouncing ball in a video. And I'm not going to tell you what goes on in the video, but it really, really shocks you when you find out what the result is. So go watch that video. It's incredible. What are you doing that's unpacking what goes on in terms of that view versus in a organization?
The funny thing about that experiment is that goes about the focus and noticing, right? So the experimenter asks you to focus on something and then you don't notice something else. So I was saying the subjects in the experiment did the right thing by focusing on, even though they didn't notice on the thing that was supposedly important. So this is where actually what you might think about failure of attention, it's not. It's a success of attention, right? I run that experiment, not really as an experiment, but I had that with students, and it's hysterically funny because at least it's funny to me, because I asked them, Please make sure, get the count right. And even the people who know what's going to happen, they fail to see because they're focusing so much on they get the count right, but they don't notice the other stuff.
How does the organization help an individual with limited attentional capacity?
Well, there are multiple ways. I mean, well, the thing that they talked about, the Carnegie School, is routines, right? Routines limit the attentional capacity needs, right? Because you don't have to be, everything attention becomes much more automatic. Then having the set of decision-making process, the way that I think about it, what are the communication channels, right? That an organization has, so they will be paying attention to the things that are important in the right place, in the right time, right?
Can you give an example of a communication that shapes attention?
People think that meetings are a waste of time. But in fact, most management is done through meetings, right? So the question is not do you have meetings? Who gets? Do you invite the right people to the meeting? Do you have a focused agenda in the meeting, right? Do you have a focused target of what to do? Well-conducted meeting has the right people, and it's focusing on a limited agenda. So you're focusing attention on the right things to make a set of decisions with all the information that you need to do that. So basically, in my work, basically an organization, the management organization is basically a network of meetings. We no longer live in these kind of more static organizations, and we have to basically convene a different set of groups. I'm doing a paper right now on an attention-based view of what people call dynamic capabilities, the ability of an organization to change, and it's by basically reconfiguring the conversations. In many ways, is what strategic leadership is that way, right? Bringing different people that don't necessarily talk to each other all the time. The coordination of the time they do that, right? So this is the management attention in a temporal dynamic way, and by the way, a lot of it is about making decisions, but a lot of it is also about just doing stuff, right? And then you go back and see if it works or not, and then it's a more iterative process. That's where the 21st century corporations are very different from this Chandelier model that I was talking earlier.
What you're actually suggesting is sometimes having long, awkward, difficult meetings are actually good. What do you think about that in terms of framing and making sense of?
If you underline sometimes.
As we think about decision-making, attention, earlier you mentioned an important concept, which is decision premises. And you mentioned routines, you mentioned meetings, which could be a form of decision premise in a way, structuring.
Well, I would say meetings are channels, and channels can have decision premises.
Right, absolutely. I'd like you to share with us what are your thoughts about culture, both organizational culture, but also culture that resides even outside the organization.
I extended this concept of institutional logics, right? So there's particular cultural understandings that are related to different institutions. Like if you're a profession, you will then channel your understanding according to professional norms and understanding. So the culture of a profession, or the culture of a family, or the culture of the market, right? Or the culture of religion.
How does the concept of institutional logic apply to healthcare? And in what ways it changes the way people make decisions?
A hospital is also not just a unitary organization that everybody works the same. So there will be different people in the hospital that will have different orientations, different logics that will be associated. If you are a nurse you're not really concerned about the profitability of the hospital, right? It will be about your professional orientation and your values as a nurse. As long as you don't get burned out, that's a whole other story, right? Which does happen a lot, right? That's going to be shaping how nurses
make
decisions and do their jobs, right? And physicians are actually a complicated example of that, right? Because physicians are more the decision makers than the nurses are, but physicians often are very market oriented too.
In that example, Willie, the logic is the culture of the profession. The nurse culture absorbed as they get trained that guides how they make decisions, what's right and what's wrong. And then physicians might have their own subculture, professional culture, which guides their decisions. But The idea being that these are decision premises, right?
Yes, and yeah, the decision purpose of a nurse and a physician are very different.
When you think about concrete examples of decision and organization that don't go well, an example that comes to mind in recent events is Boeing doing a poor job in...
A clear attentional problem.
Right. So what's your reading about those type of decisions being made in terms of design, execution, lack of quality control? And what's your take on what a new CEO would do to fix those problems?
By the way, that's a great example of the logic story, right? Because Boeing used to be a very engineering-focused company, right? And then when they merged with Douglas, when they became much more market-focused, they moved their headquarters from Seattle to Chicago, and then I forget where they are right now. So they were less about safety. So their safety culture kind of became less important than their short-term profitability, right? So they cut. And they had a lot of pressures, these engineers, to do things. They were mission on, let's meet the targets. And they cut, something with the Dreamliner, something with the 737 MAX. They made all sorts of mistakes. This has been going on for a long time. So it's like, this is a great example of the shift of market logic, shifting attention to the wrong priorities if you really want to be put safety first.
What would be a good 5-minute exercise that you can practice as maybe a senior level manager? Maybe you own your own restaurant and you're looking at how I can be more attentive to all the different stakeholders, all the different people that are part of this restaurant. What do you think would be a good 5-minute exercise that they can actually do that will allow them to be more attentive?
Well, there's another perspective on attention, or a complementary one, that talks about mindfulness, right? And this is a notion of mindfulness, right? And sometimes you're more mindful if you're able to basically become more attentive to things by basically removing distractions.
Willie, is an implication of what you're saying also that not being in the weeds allows you to see the bigger picture?
Yeah, completely, right. Yeah, that's a completely.
And so basically that to be good at paying attention to a wider range of issues, it is important to have the time to do it. Well,
right.
What are your thoughts about it?
And not only to the wider array of issues, but then to sometimes someone unconsciously prioritize differently. That's some of why you have this conflict in your brain, because you think this is the priority when that's not really what you want, right? And then because it could be the opposite, you're paying attention to so many things that it's really hard to disentangle them, right? So then, you withdraw to restructure your priorities.
With that, this conversation was incredibly interesting. And we especially want to thank Willie for being part of this conversation. And if you need to chat with him or chat with any of us, feel free to reach out, leave comments. We're always excited to see what you have to say.
Can I say something about that? I'm not very good at managing attention.
Yeah.
So if I don't answer your email, try again. Don't take it personal.
I have to say, I have to share an anecdote on this. Right?
Okay.
Which is actually very revealing about how Willie manages his attention. I reached out to him via email and said, "Hey, do you have time I have something to tell you," which was inviting him for this conversation. First email went unanswered. A few days later, I email him again. Then I get an answer. Then I talk to him, and then he tells me, "Pino, I never answer any email the first time." Which is a way to manage attention. Right? What are your thoughts about the conversation?
I think it's fantastic, right? It actually, what's really fantastic about it is we talked about not just about attention, but about logics, about power, about governance, all the other stuff. This is what you're talking about my whole career.